Hi, everyone. My name is Adrienne Procaccini, and I'm the senior editor at 47 North, which is Amazon Publishing's science fiction and fantasy imprint. I am really pleased to be your moderator today, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. So glad we get to see each other virtually. Even virtually is great. Our panel today is The Past is Future, how science fiction and fantasy writers are influenced by history. And I found in my time working in science fiction and fantasy publishing that lots of us writers and editors are really studying history as well, myself included. So when I was in grammar school, I really wanted to be an archaeologist, just like Indiana Jones when I grew up. I did like a class presentation on it and everything. I wanted to win the school's award for best grades in history. In what can only be described as a twist of fate, I got the Language Arts Award instead. But since I bring up Indiana Jones, and I'm guessing there may be a couple fans here, I wanted to share a quick piece of trivia with you that I learned from How to Drink, which is a YouTube channel that you should definitely check out if you're into that kind of thing. And apologies to some of my team members who may be listening because they've heard this story before, but you know that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark when Marion is trapped in Belloq's tent and they're drinking this clear alcohol and Marion asks, "What is this stuff?" And Belloq says, "It's my family label." So we all assume he's French, his family makes grappa or something like that, but someone actually translated the Arabic on the bottle and the brand printed is literally "my family label." So he told a nerd joke. And that concludes my Jeopardy audition. But back on the topic at hand, N.K. Jemisin recently said, how can we prepare for the future if we don't acknowledge the past? We can't run our histories, but we can make new stories from them. And some of the most memorable stories in science fiction and fantasy are influenced by or a reaction to actual historical events and their aftermaths. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce today's panelists. First, we have Marko Kloos. Marko is the author of 2 series of military science fiction, The Palladium Wars and Frontlines, and is a member of George R. R. Martin's Wildcards Consortium. Born in Germany and raised in and around the city of Munster, Marko was previously a soldier, bookseller, freight dock worker, and corporate IT administrator before deciding that he wasn't cut out for anything except making stuff up for fun and profit. Hi, Marko.
Hello.
Next is Jeff Wheeler, Wall Street Journal bestselling author of the Grave Kingdom series, the Harbinger series, the King Fountain series, and the upcoming First Argentine series. A husband, father, and full-time writer after taking an early retirement from Intel, Jeff lives in the Rocky Mountains. His latest novel is The Buried World, and The Immortal Words releases in just a few weeks. Hi, Jeff.
Hello.
Then we have Luanne G. Smith. Luanne lives in Colorado at the base of the beautiful Rocky Mountains, where she enjoys hiking, gardening, and a glass of wine at the end of the day. She is the author of the Washington Post and Amazon charts bestseller, The Vine Witch, and its recently released follow-up, The Glimmerist. Hi, Luanne. And finally is Rysa Walker, the best-selling author of the Delphi trilogy, including the ITW Award-nominated The Delphi Effect and the Chronos Files series, which includes Timebound, grand prize winner in the 2013 Amazon Breakthrough Novel Awards. Her career had its beginnings in a childhood on a cattle ranch where she read every book she could find, watched Star Trek and The Twilight Zone, and let her imagination soar into the future and to distant worlds. Her newest novel, Now, Then, and Everyone, released this April. Hey, Rysa.
Hi.
So I'd really like to start with a question for all of you. Also, I want to emphasize that I definitely want to treat this panel as a discussion. So if any point during the panel you'd like to add something, please feel free. We're all friends here, even if the question isn't initially directed at you. And hopefully the topics and themes that we're talking about are relevant to all of you. So since this is a panel about how history influences your work, I'd like to know which historical era inspired your books in order to set the stage here? Jeff, why don't we start with you? Many of your books, including the upcoming Knights Ransom, are inspired by European history, but in the latest series, The Grave Kingdom, it's decidedly Chinese. What about ancient China drew you to it, and what made you return to medieval Europe afterwards?
Well, that's a great question. For me, I had an opportunity to go to China and spend a month there. And being in the architecture, being among the culture, and then learning that they didn't even really know their own past, they needed to make it up for them. So they needed a Lord of the Rings set in China. So I did a lot of research, did a lot of reading, and a lot of visiting some of the ancient sites that are there during my trip. And it was just fascinating to me. I think probably my first love is still medieval European history. So I'm going back to that with First Argentines, because there's just so many things. But I'm inspired by Victorian era history as well as others. So one thing about being a writer is you don't have to just stay in the same era in order to come up with a series.
That's awesome. That's a great story about Grave Kingdom series. And I'm really excited for your next books too. Marko, since you write science fiction, it might be sort of a strange question, but I actually think that it's also relevant to the books in your Palladium War series.
Yeah, it's in my first series, I didn't really have a historical template, but in the Palladium Wars, I very definitely deliberately picked one. And you know, being from Germany, I wanted to have something from a cultural perspective that's not usually common for examination in the US, you know, because it's like, you know, I don't know if you know 20th century history in Europe, but Germany may have had a few run-ins with the other European countries over the course of the century, and, you know, lost both of them. So there's a whole different, I thought it might be interesting because so much of military sci-fi, you know, military fiction in general is about the war itself and winning the war and, you know, all the heroism and all that stuff. But I thought it might be interesting to examine my grandfather fought in World War II on the German side and on the losing side, and he never talked about it. And one day I found myself, when I was, you know, thinking about ideas for a new series, I thought about the fact that, and this is something that you don't realize when you're a kid, that you only realize when you're an adult and you have some experience. Like, he never talked about the war. I'd ask him stuff about it, you know, Grandpa, what was it like in the Second World War? And he'd like quickly change the subject. He never told me anything about it. And only now as an adult do I understand why, you know, because of all the trauma that he went through. But then I went to thinking that might be a much more interesting story because, you know, Frontlines is young man goes to war, kind of. And I wanted the maybe not the polar opposite, but I was like, how do you invert that trope that is so common in military sci-fi, which is, you know, the whole young man goes to war and, you know, advances through the ranks and all that stuff. How about older man comes home from war? And not only does he come home from war, but what if he comes home from a war that he lost? And not only did he lose the war, or his side lost the war, what if you were on the bad side? You know, what if you were the bad guys? And that I find is something that has not been really examined in military sci-fi, especially with authors from the Western Hemisphere, especially like, you know, North American, because we have this kind of sometimes a little bit jingoistic thing going on, especially in military sci-fi, where it's too much about the guns and there's not much about what happens when the guns are silent and how you pick up the pieces.
Right, definitely. It's a unique perspective that I really appreciate in that series. Rysa, how about you? You write time travel novels most recently.
Yes, I just wanted to say in response to Marko, though, that my grandfather was exactly the same way talking about World War II. He did not want to broach the subject at all. He nearly died jumping off a ship. And the things that he had to do, he didn't want to talk about. So I think it's a kind of a universal with that generation. And given that I write time travel, the answer depends very much on which book I'm in the middle of as to which time period I focus on the most. The first Chrono series dealt a lot with the 1893 World's Fair, and then some in 1930s, 1960s. Now Then and Everywhen, the first book in the Chronos Origin series, is pretty firmly set in the civil rights era of the 1960s, and then the next book in that series will be set just before the start of World War II.
Very cool. Yeah, I can't wait to read that one. Luanne, how about you? You write historical fantasy.
I write historical fantasy, and The Vine Witch is probably there's two eras really. It's set in the late Belle Epoque era. 1909 is what I have in mind when I wrote it, but there's also the influence of the witch trials from 1600s, which also both of them meet in the book in a unique way, I think. But yeah, so that's my historical take.
Cool. So now that we have that all out in the open, I want to talk about fantasy first, which might seem like the most obvious place to start when we discuss historical fantasies, historical influences. So Luanne and Jeff, this one both for you. Do you feel like fantasy versus science fiction by its very nature is more suited to those historical parallels?
Well, I will say that for me, those are my favorite things to read are historical fantasy or historical fiction and fantasy. And for me, they blend almost perfectly because I think fantasy actually has its roots in the oral storytelling tradition. At least for me, I do fairy tales and folk tales, mythology. I rely on that a lot for my stories. And if you look back at those stories, I mean, they're full of fairies and witches and, fantastic beasts and otherworldly beings. And it's just a perfect mix for me to have those two. I was going to say that I don't know if a lot of people have noticed this about my books when they read them, but I kind of rely on Shakespeare and those historical stories. Like the first one's Macbeth and then Midsummer Night's Dream, and then the third one's kind of a Romeo and Juliet story. But those first two are definitely fantasies, Macbeth and Midsummer Night's Dream, all about witches and fairies again. And
yeah,
so I like to incorporate that stuff into my stories.
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm. What about you, Jeff?
And that's a really good point, Luanne. I appreciate that too. And especially when, events from your novels can kind of play out in modern times. Like in my Harbinger series, I talk about the cholera epidemic a bit because that happened during the past, and people like, hey, how did you know about coronavirus? It's like, that's a totally different kind of thing. But sometimes those things do play out. But it's funny, when I thought of your question, Adrian, I actually think about my, growing up watching Star Trek and thinking how much science fiction ends up influencing modern technology, right? None of us, when the first flip phones came out, were like, hey, I've seen that before. And we didn't even imagine, the Enterprise being on Wi-Fi, or things like that. Sometimes when Star Wars, they have to plug the droid into the wall to connect. It's like they hadn't foreseen certain technologies, but I really think science fiction plays a very strong role in inventing the future as well. And is just as relevant.
Yeah, definitely. And to that point, does the science fiction and authors here have anything to add to that?
It kind of cut out, so I wasn't sure what the last part is.
Sorry about that. I was wondering, to Jeff's point about science fiction and influencing the future, whether the science fiction authors had anything to add to that.
Oh, I mean, it definitely influences the future. I mean, Star Trek is probably I would say, the best example of it. But I mean, if you look at classic science fiction stories, so many scientists say that the way they even got into the field was through the fact of science fiction. They read science fiction, they enjoyed science fiction, and it inspired them to move into the field of science. So I think definitely.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's really hard not to fall into that when you do science fiction and you try to kind of extrapolate the technology that's going to exist in 100 years. It's really hard not to fall in what I call the high-tech airship conundrum, where there's this thing like I don't know if you saw this on the internet, but I came across this series of postcards once from 1900, and there were like these lithograph, these drawings of what people imagined the year 2000 to be. And it was just all like people in 1900 style clothing with 1900 style technology. It's just that, they had airships and like all the, it was kind of like steampunky, but it was totally like, level 1900 technology, just with wings bolted on, like that, the firefighters with the little wings on the backpacks, but they were still hosing the fire down with tanks on their backs and the little hoses with the bell ends, just they are trying to imagine how life would be 100 years down the road, but they didn't get past, okay, what we have just with wings, and maybe if it can fly, that'd be cool too. But it's like really, as common as sci-fi is, it's really hard to find writers who were dead on in predicting technology 50 years down the road. Like I think Arthur C. Clarke, was it that correct who correctly predicted satellites, the worldwide network of satellites? I think might have been Arthur C. Clarke, but it still stands out because it was rare, because somebody got their finger on the possible technology in 50 years about a worldwide communications network, and the signal bouncing off of satellites that circle the Earth. And most science fiction authors of that age didn't quite get it right. They were still stuck in the high-tech steampunk airship stage.
Right, like Jules Verne, he sort of predicted how we get to the moon, right? Like shooting basically a bullet out of a cannon into space. But somebody else was going to say something. Go ahead. Nope. Okay. Well, so actually, I read an article recently by Charlie Jane Anders that was titled "To Write About the Future is to Represent the Past." And it discussed how science fiction specifically recalls our history on the other side of the equation. And she used an example of Isaac Asimov's Foundation is a riff on Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. So Marko, back to you. Is writing about future events just a chance to explore our past from like the safety of imagination and distance?
Yeah, I think so. Like how's the saying go? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So you got the same patterns through history over and over and over again, because we think it's like when you raise teenagers. It's like they think that parents are the dumbest creatures on the planet, and they're the first ones to experience love and to figure things out. And they're just like the smartest being. And like every generation goes through that teenage stage where they're like, we don't need to learn anything from history. We're like, the only reason XYZ hasn't worked yet is because we haven't been in charge yet. And then, we mellow out and we get into our middle age. And then we realize that our parents were not quite as dumb as we thought they were. And it's that way when you look at history, it keeps repeating the same patterns, which is handy for fiction writers because we can borrow from it, because it's not so much of a stretch to, because any period of history you can just kind of borrow and tweak, like George R. R. Martin did with Game of Thrones. Of course, that's, he started off with he kind of took the War of the Roses as a template. Of course, the Tudors didn't have dragons and stuff, which would have been cool. I mean, the history books would have been a whole lot more interesting, but it's, yes, history is definitely we lean on it quite heavily, whether we're aware of it or not. We either borrow it from it consciously or subconsciously. The smart people borrow from it consciously because it saves you a lot of work with constructing your storylines, because you can already steal so much from the history books that people aren't even aware of.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Rysa, does time travel give you a way to like change the past if you want to?
Well, you'd be surprised how many times I've had people ask me that question, especially this year. I keep getting emails and social media questions. Could you do something or have Kate do something about 2020, please? And I've actually played around with the idea of writing a novella dealing with that, because I think so many people need that catharsis right now, because 2020 needs a redo, basically. But the Kronos universe in some ways is a slight tweak on history, because there are not any Cyrus in our particular timeline, and that's the religion that's in my books. It's kind of a mix of Ayn Rand and some elements of Christian fundamentalism, but it's only for a tiny blip. And I think I shy away, as someone who taught history, I shy away from making any radical changes when I write. The alt history I write is usually a bit of a tweak on history. I think I'm kind of like one of the villains in my series, Simon. Simon is willing to change history somewhat, but not much, because if he tweaked it too much, Marilyn Monroe might not be born, or the Yankees might not have their winning streak in the 1930s. And the playground that he enjoys would be radically altered. And I think when I write, I kind of like having real history as a touchstone. And that's one reason in my books at the back, I always put what's real and what isn't. And, you know, where I took liberties to some extent with the history, and where I tried to stick pretty firmly to what actually happened. So that's, I don't want to change it too much, but I'm willing to tweak around the edges. And I would be willing to do 2020 as a complete do-over at this point.
Yeah, please, let's rewrite.
Yes.
Great, yeah. I love your little notes in the backs of your books, by the way. Those are my favorite. It's like insider knowledge. But so I wanted to move on to the topic of craft and discuss kind of how your work has taken shape. Jeff, obviously a lot of your novels can be called historical fantasy. How do you do your research?
Well, I love to read biographies and history, but I'm always looking for the little details that most people don't know about. Because if they say, "Oh, you're just retelling, you know, the War of the Roses," or you're, you know, telling the story of Mary Tudor, I like twisting things or finding those things that aren't as common. When I find one of those nuggets, that really makes my day. So I do a lot of reading. I watch, you know, period pieces, you know, movies, television, just to kind of flood my brain with sensory details from that era. And then I just incubate it for a series of time before I got my characters and my cast and my plot before I ever start writing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very cool. Luanne, how about you?
Pretty the same. I mean, I do spend time reading nonfiction novels, or novels and nonfiction as research, but it just struck me when he was talking also, you know, I do the videos too, and I sit in on forums that have very specific knowledge bases. There's a forum out there for everything, and sometimes I'll go in there and eavesdrop. And then the other thing is I'm a very visual person, so I use Pinterest like crazy, collect all the photos that I want to have as images for my stories. And I start with that. But also, I don't know, I have, I have bookshelves full of spell books and all sorts of things, because I didn't know anything about witchcraft when I started this, other than just a mild interest in it, you know?
Yeah.
But you just have to read it, and you watch videos, and a nice trip to Paris would have been awesome, but I didn't have that in the budget at the time. So, you know, you just do the best you can with the videos and Street View. And the other thing is, I was going to mention, it's helpful if anybody's a historical writer, especially like with certain characters like Yvette, she tends to get a little modern sounding. So I go to the, online etymology dictionary, and it'll tell you how long a word's been in use and stuff. So I find I have to check her dialogue quite a lot to make sure she's not using too many new words. So.
Yeah, it's really cool that you mentioned Pinterest, because one of the things that I love about your novels is how atmospheric and visual they are. And so that makes complete sense that's how you're doing it.
Describe it and work it into the book. I have to start there.
Yeah, cool. Anybody else have anything to add on that point? I mean, Rysa, how about you?
Oh, I use Pinterest a lot. All the things she was talking about, Google Street View. If I can't go there in person to check it out, I will hit Google Street View and figure out how many times or how many paces it would be to walk somewhere. And the same thing you were talking about with etymology, with time travel, I have a little more leeway on that because most of my characters have been in other times or were specifically trained to be part of that era. But yes, I have to check with other characters and find out whether or not a particular phrase would have been used in 1939 or et cetera.
Yeah, that's tough. That's tough to figure out. But that's super cool to hear you guys talk about like how you do those things. So I am sure that we have often heard it said that history is written by the victor. And I think there are a bunch of different ways to craft narrative in fiction, but Marko, you write from multiple points of view in Palladium Wars in particular. Do you feel like this gives you an opportunity to examine history from those different perspectives? I mean, you talk about how you're writing from the perspective of the losing side, for instance.
Oh yeah, it's the Palladium Wars. I mean, I deliberately designed it to be that way because, you know, that was my first novel where I did multiple POVs because, you know, Frontlines is single POV, present tense, and I wanted to go with the narrative structure. I wanted to go the exact opposite too, which we know. So it was going to be multiple POVs, past tense, a little more traditional, and then I structured it so that each of the POVs would be, you're looking at a conflict from 4 different angles, you know, from the civilian angle, from the military angle, from the angle of the victor, and from the angle of the defeated. So I had to have 4 characters that represented each of those strands. You know, you've got the active duty military, you've got the defeated military man who was on the losing side, you've got the, you know, the occupation, you know, force representative, and you have the civilian of the losing side. So you have all these 4 perspectives. You know, you have military and civilian, which are totally different viewpoints to begin with, and then you also have the viewpoints of the people who won the conflict and the ones who lost it, and seeing how all 4 of these 4 people, you know, see the conflict from all these different sides. Because, you know, when you look at history, it's like, it's so cliche to just do the bad guys, and they're like, you know, we wanted to take over the universe, ha ha ha, because evil. But that's not how the world works. Like, everybody in their own story is the good guy. Like, nobody is the bad guy in their own narrative. And I wanted to kind of get this across, like, that even the people who committed these horrible things during the war had in their mind a good reason, and they were in their mind the aggrieved party. And I wanted to kind of pull it off to where, when you write the POV, that you don't make readers eye roll and go, oh, come on, you know, that's just like stereotypically Dr. Evil of the League of Evil. You know, it's like you know, you see how they came to why they did what they did, and then in the end you figure, you know, well, they might not agree with that point, but they had a point as to, you know, why they went to war and why they did what they did. So it's much more complex to look at conflict, you know, in this like layered perspective, rather than just doing it one-dimensional. So definitely, it's absolutely, to answer your question, yes, and I deliberately designed it that way from the start.
Yeah. Does anybody else have anything to add on that point? Like, people experimenting with multi-POV, finding one way to write better than another?
I've definitely discovered that I don't want to do multiple. I'm co-authoring a series called Haddonwood, and we bit off way more than we could chew in terms of how long it takes to write the books, because you have to worry about continuity with all of those different points of view. And we are not Stephen King in The Stand. I don't know how he did it. But,
yeah.
But yes, it's difficult, and it's something I've enjoyed doing, and I think that, you know, we finally came to a good place, especially by the time we started the second book. But both of us are saying, nope, no more of that. 2 points of view, 3 points of view. That's the most we're ever going to do again. So no more of the 6 points of view.
Yeah. Cool. So as a follow-up to discussing perspectives, we have here an author who has written for a YA audience, and then we have others who write for crossover ages. And I'm wondering if storytelling provides a way to introduce younger readers to heavier topics that you might not think would be otherwise addressed? And if so, what have you found is the best way to deal with those topics and those issues? If Jeff is here, we can start with him.
With who? With me?
If Jeff's on, we can start with Jeff, and then we can go to you, Rysa, too,
Yeah.
for sure.
Sorry, my internet keeps dropping. So why don't you start with Luanne?
Okay. We'll start with Rysa.
Okay. The main reason that I shifted over from doing YA to doing the Chronos Origins series as adult is that I just really couldn't figure out a way to have teenagers get their hands on the Chronos keys and really fit these characters and do them justice. But I've always written for older teens. I don't think that I necessarily want to aim at an age group where I'm introducing difficult topics. But the main thing is to try to get them to empathize, I think. I read something a while back looking at how the historical track of novels was very similar to the historical progression of the concept of human rights. And I think that's because novels allow you to actually require you really to put yourself into the perspective of another person. And that's something that that can be difficult sometimes. Once you've learned to empathize though with a character, then sometimes you can expand that to groups of people that you were never around as a child, people who are outside your sphere, basically. But one thing that I've liked about doing time travel for that age group is that I can take a character that is a modern teen, basically, and put them along with other people who are fish out of water. For instance, in Time's Edge, I had an interracial couple and also a gay man who were both put into the late 1930s. And one thing that Kate discovers is that things that she would have considered very commonplace occurrences could have deadly consequences in the 1930s for those individuals. So it does give you a way to kind of cut into the more difficult material than you would have otherwise.
Right. Jeff, you want to give it a shot?
Did you repeat the question?
Sure. So I'm wondering if writing for a crossover type age, if there's a good way or a way to introduce younger readers to more difficult topics through the narrative.
For me, I don't think teenagers shy away from difficult topics. Like take Neil Shusterman's Unwind about retroactive abortions. My kids love that series. I like that series. You give them hard stuff, and that's okay. You don't shy away from difficult things. I think just how much detail you go into, you just have to be a little bit more careful with YA. But absolutely, I think what our kids have to go through, the school shootings and things that they have to deal with, are things I never had to deal with when I was younger.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So as we circle around this sort of idea of a shared history, I saw a theory that music and literature have the same mechanisms for engaging a shared emotional response and then therefore eliciting sympathy. Rysa, popular music is really important in your novel. How do you think including music in your narrative serves the work's greater purpose for you?
For me, music really evokes an era. I mean, I can think of specific times in my life, and a song will just yank me right back to that time. Like Elton John's Crocodile Rock puts me right back on a cattle farm, washing out buckets inside the barn. And in the same way, there's some country songs that will yank me back to being in the back seat of a station wagon sucking in secondhand smoke. So they can have bad memories too. But they, in terms of an entire era, if you hear a song by the Andrews Sisters, that's gonna, World War II is gonna pop into your head fairly quickly. Now Then and Everyone, the first book in the Kronos Origin series, it has a very specific musical tie in that the Beatles are sort of peripheral characters. Their concert in August of 1966 is the setting and part of the backdrop for the climax of the book. So I actually had to listen to, a playlist that was that specific concert, including the acts that came on before it, in order to pace out the book itself. So my kids were thoroughly tired of hearing that particular set list for the Red Rubber Ball by the Circles, and a bunch of other ones for the groups that came on before the Beatles, and then the Beatles themselves. So they were tired of that. And then of course in the next book, it's Billie Holiday actually plays a bit part in that one. So her song Strange Fruit was kind of the catalyst for some key scenes in that book as well. So yeah, it plays a huge role, and not just in the personal sense, but in the sense that I want to use it to evoke the era that I'm having them travel back to.
Yeah, I think, I'm really into the Umbrella Academy right now, and they do a super great job at that as an example. But does anybody else on the panel, like Rysa said, sort of use a soundtrack that you write to, or like have any musical influences for your work?
Can't say I do, no, not music.
What do you use then, if not music? Dress?
Like I said, I use a lot of visuals, but my third book, which is all about perfume, I went out and bought all the little perfumes to have them when I was writing, like jasmine and different things, and I smell that, because the scent is very tied to memory as well, like music.
Very much.
With certain smells, if you can get that tied to a memory somehow and write about it, it's kind of cool. Yeah,
it's definitely playlists for me. Like I have to make a playlist for every book that I write, and I can and now when I've written, I can neither confirm nor deny that I've written the first 2 or 3 books of Frontlines almost exclusively because it has to be a soundtrack that has no lyrics in it, because the lyrics yank me out, but it has to be mood evoking. And game and TV soundtracks are perfect for that, because that's what they're designed to do. Is they're designed to produce a mood without yanking you away from the story. So the first few Frontlines novels I wrote almost entirely to the Battlestar Galactica soundtrack by Van McCreary. And now still, when I hear that soundtrack now, 10 years later, I'm still right back in the book, and I have to have there's playlists I have. I actually should share them on my webpage, because some people might be interested in that. But I have playlists for every book that I wrote. It has to be the exact right mood. You couldn't write military sci-fi to a Baroque soundtrack or whatever, but
you could try, I guess.
So you have to have this carefully calibrated playlist but then the disadvantage to that is when you're done with the book and you're in the I don't ever want to see this manuscript again after the edits, whatever, you cannot listen to that playlist again for at least another year.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. To change tacks a bit, I want to talk about how history changes our understanding of what is supernatural and what is science fact. So, for example, there was large shifts in philosophy in the Age of Enlightenment. Luanne, in your book, there's a man of science who sort of bumped up right against fantastical. And so I was wondering if you have an opinion on how fantasy as a genre might evolve when we know more about our natural world.
Yeah, John Paul kind of gets a lesson in witchcraft's place in nature from a monk in the book, who explains to him it's kind of like bacteria, and there are good bacteria and bad bacteria. But for a long time, we didn't know what caused illnesses or whatever, or fermentation process of wines and cheeses. But because of microscopes, we learned. And so he tries to relate that to witchcraft also, or magic, being on that same sort of spectrum. And yet we just don't have the knowledge yet to understand, to see it at work yet. But we might someday, because you never know. Like, it's on the spectrum out there, and we might find some way to measure it someday, if magic's real. And I like to hold open hope,
That
keep
magic's real.
alive, you know, in the world. We don't want to have so much science that there are no mysteries left at all anymore.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I like that a lot. Do you have anything to add to that, Jeff?
Well, the belief in magic goes back, a really long time, but I like to base my magic systems on plausible things or things that I've read, in other sources like medieval documents, the Hammer of Witches, what did they believe was possible back then? So I've liked to look at things like that, but absolutely, it has to feel real enough to the reader and to actually make them want to believe it's real. Like, oh,
yeah.
I wish
Am I frozen? Can you still hear me? Oh, good.
Jeff's frozen.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So we have just about 3 minutes left. And instead of going to the last question that I had, I sort of wanted to end it on like a fun note and ask you all what, sort of like just be fans and like ask you all what you're reading or watching right now that you're really excited about. So Luanne, let's start with you.
Well, as you know, I'm doing research for some new novels I'm writing. And one of the books I just finished, and it was so good. It's called Live, and it's about the Jack the Ripper victims. Not about him. It's not about the murders. It's about them and their lives and how they ended up on those streets at that particular moment to be victims. It was so good, though. And somehow I'll work some of that into the novel.
Cool. Marko, how about you? You're on mute.
Okay, I did read The Expanse, which was spectacular. I just finished that, and we saved up the Star Trek Picard to watch, and we just finished that too, and I think that was some terrific writing. And don't laugh, we always find stuff to binge that, and this is something that I knew existed, but I hadn't watched, and it's kind of embarrassing because it's a 15-year-old show, but we just started watching Grey's Anatomy, and we really dig it, and it kind of reminded me about the what makes good fiction is because I like it because it is a perfect balance between irreverent and profound. It never slides off too much into the profound to be cheesy, and it never slides off so much into the irreverent to be like superficial. And it has characters that you care about, like almost from the beginning. So that's kind of like the hallmark of good fiction. So we're kind of really enjoying that, even if it has nothing to do with sci-fi or fantasy, but it's just a reminder of how to do good fiction.
Yeah. Rysa, how about you?
Well, you mentioned the Umbrella Academy. I actually have not been able to watch that yet, but my husband has been watching it, and I heard what you meant by the soundtrack, and I told him, I said, okay, now I've absolutely got to watch it because the soundtrack is so good. So I'm going back in for that. Finishing up Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which is one of our guilty pleasures, and I'm reading Chuck Wendig's The Wanderers, or is it just Wanderers? I think just Wanderers, which I had started and then dove into a whole bunch of reading projects and hadn't had much reading time. So
cool. All right, Jeff, go.
Don't watch a lot of TV, but I've been reading a book, The Enemy of All Mankind. It's about a pirate heist and the beginning of multinational corporations. And it's so fascinating. I can't put it down. by Stephen Berlin Johnson.
All right. Cool. So we are almost out of time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, virtual audience. Thank you, ReedPop and Metaverse for setting this up. Once again, we have Marko Kloos, Jeff Wheeler, Luanne G. Smith, and Rysa Walker. Find their books available now, and hope to see you again sometime soon.